notions, the aggregate of notions. Now we will read the aggregate of co-producing factors. Unfortunately, this is translated as karma formations. I don't know why Professor Santani chose this, but at least we should remove the word karma. It doesn't work here already. So just imagine that the word karma is not in this translation. So the aggregates of co-producing factors, samskara, is of three types. They can be wholesome, unwholesome, and undeterminate. And this refers to two types. Well, actually, that also, I think he made he made a very small mistake. Okay, that's fine. The syntax in his translation is not very clear. The point is this. I will try to explain it a little bit more clearly than this translation. The aggregates called co-producing factors for the Vaibhashika is divided into two types. One type is called formations which are applied together with the mind. The other one is called formations which are not applied together with the mind. So the first type is a type of nama. So it has to do with the mind. And any other kind of mental attitude like wisdom, ignorance, attachment, aversion, anything. All of that falls within formations or co-producing factors associated with the mind or applied together with the mind. They're called applied together because they refer to the same object as the object of the mind, and they arise at the same time, etc., etc. So, for example, if I'm perceiving this bottle, my perception may be accompanied by ignorance about this bottle. That ignorance falls under formations which are applied together with the mind. There's another type of formations which are not applied together with the mind. And these are a special category of Vaibhashika Vidharma, and these serve specific purposes, sometimes to explain the process of dependent arising. So we have this set, I think 13 or 14 factors, which have different functions. It's a very specific list. They're similar to the mind because they do not have physical form. They're not in any place. But they're not applied together with the mind. They're not sentient. So they don't fall into rupa, they don't fall into nama. It's a special category. That's what he's referring to. So, what he refers here is that for the formations associated with the mind, they can be of three types: wholesome, unwholesome, or undeterminate. The other formations are a specific list. This is what this means. The syntax of this translation doesn't make it too clear. I'm afraid it's a little bit confusing. But actually, it means what I just said. There's two types. The first one can be of three qualities: virtues, non-virtues, neither. And then the second type is a specific list of very special categories in Vaibhashika Vihara, not accepted by Sautrantika. Sautrantika thinks they don't exist. So this is special for Vaibhashika. Okay, lastly, the aggregate of consciousness is apprehension of an object. Objects such as visible form, etc. It starts with visible form because we start with the eye. So eye consciousness is the apprehension of visible form, the perception of visible form. The word here is Vishaya Upadapti. Actually, the word used is Vishaya, which may be better translated with domain rather than object. Sanskrit distinguishes clearly between domain and object. We don't usually respect this in translation very well. But for example, I'll try to explain what is the difference. Vishaya, or a domain, is a domain for an activity, for a function. So if you take visible form, like a patch of yellow, this functions as a domain for the eye and also for the consciousness. But it functions as a point of reference or object only for the consciousness, because the eye is not sentient. The eye has a function in respect to that. It has, when they come together, the function of the eye is to give rise to consciousness. But consciousness is the one which actually perceives the object. It's the actual perception of the object. It's the one which is sentient. So being sentient is what it means to take a point of reference. So we can distinguish between just being the domain of a certain activity, but sometimes we use domain. Domain can apply to both. Point of reference is only for the consciousness. So the perception of a certain, we could also say the perception of an object in this case, they can be interchanged in the definition. But perceiving something, just perceiving something is consciousness. And again, we can divide it into 6, just as before. Visual consciousness, etc. Now he goes back to explain the meaning of skandha. We translate as aggregate. So why do we translate as aggregate? There could be other meanings for skandha actually. This word can mean many different things. But he says it has to mean a heap because of what is said in the sutras. If we read the sutras, which explain about the aggregate of form, it says, what he translated here in this way, whatever form there is, past, future or present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near, all of these, putting it together, we call the aggregate of form. So we can understand that we are heaping up many things mentally. We collect some things mentally, that all heap is called aggregate. And he says this is what we should follow because that's what in the scripture. We could try to give some other meaning, but let's check the sutras. The sutras say this, so better take it in this sense. That is the idea. Now he's going to offer a very useful discussion, in my opinion, about why we have this order. Why don't we say Vedana, Samskara, Samnya, and then Rupa? Why don't we shuffle? Why do we say form, feeling, notion? Is there any reason to have this order? And he gives us different reasons. First reason, from coarse to subtle. Something coarse, meaning is easier to perceive, to something very subtle. So he explains, form is the most gross, meaning the most coarse, because it's subject to resistance. Avarana, we can block it. That's the only aggregate which can be blocked. So it's easy to perceive. Nowadays we focus only on that. Like when we think of existence, we think that it's the things which are really there. You can touch it, you can see it. But actually, that's from the point of view of Buddhist Abhidharma, it's not so. That's just, it's the easiest one to perceive, that's all. Among the formless skandhas, the skandhas which do not have any blocking, feeling is the most gross because it looks like it is somewhere. Actually, feeling is nowhere, but we feel like, oh, I have this feeling in my hand, I have this feeling in my foot. Actually, it is not in a place. It's that our mind arises in a certain way due to something that happens to a certain part of our body, and we are focusing mentally on that part. But actually, the feeling is not in any specific place. Perception or notion is more coarse than the aggregate of co-producing factors, and karma formations are more coarse than consciousness. So it doesn't really explain why, because it probably considers it somewhat intuitive. It's in terms of what is a more fundamental and bare function of cognition. Consciousness is the barest function of cognition, just perceiving something to be there, without anything further. So that's the most difficult to see. So that's the first reason. The second reason is how the process of defilement works, sanklesha. The purpose of Buddhist Abhidharma is liberation. This is a gradual process of vyavadana, of purification. So, in order to obtain purification, we should know how defilement works. How does our mind get afflicted? And this is explained by the order of the aggregates. So here he gives an example of women and men. What is it that makes for a man a woman, and for a woman a man immediately attractive? Form. It's the aggregate of form. So that's the first one. And this is due to attachment to the feeling of pleasure. And then from that one gets some wrong perception. Shubha. One thinks, oh, women are shubha, they're pure, lovely, attractive. That's why there is a shubha bhavana. That's why it's a viparita samya, distorted notion. And from this, I'm going to translate it a bit differently. I think there's a problem with the text. And from this erroneous perception, distorted perception, we get kleshas. We get the mental defilements which fall under the fourth aggregate. And then, from there, the mind becomes defiled. So the mind is defiled by them. So you see that it goes from form up to consciousness. That's a process of defilement. Third reason. Okay, this has to do with a simile, an example. An example of a cooking pot. Bhajana adi arthena. Of a cooking pot and so forth. But actually, there's a cooking pot. What is the pot? Form, the body. And the rest, feeling and the rest, are like the content of the pot. Feeling is good because it's enjoyed. Is food, because it's what we eat. It's enjoyed, it means we consume it, we eat it. Perception is like the seasoning, and because it adds some flavor to that feeling. And the formations are like the cook, because they put together, they make past actions mature or cook, vipaka, and give it to consciousness. And consciousness then enjoys that food. So there is this simile of a pot and eating food. That's why we have this order. Is the third reason. Okay, that part was about the aggregates. Now we have to start with the elements. it translates as elements, it translates usually as bases, but it's okay. And we should read it, we can chant it once, it's from here. Tatra Vikshavaha Tatame Ashtadasha Dhatavaha Tadyatha Chakshurdhatuh Rupadhatuh Chakshurvijnanadhatuh Shrotradhatuh Shabdadhatuh Shrotravignanadhatuh Granadhatuh Gandhadhatuh Granavijnanadhatuh Jihvadhatuh Rasadhatuh Jihva Vijnanadhatuh Kayadhatuh Sprashtavyadhatuh Kaya Vijnanadhatuh Manodhatuh Dharmadhatuh Manovijnanadhatuh Ime Vikshava Uchyante Shtadasha Dhatavaha. So this is a translation. It uses element rather than base. It might be okay. Usually the meaning of dhatu is something like a mineral ore, a point of origin, because they again produce something similar to themselves. Like when you have an ore of a certain mineral, like gold, you can pull gold again and again. So that's the idea. So now he explains that these are based on a division of support, ashraya, what is supported, ashrita, and the object of that support, alambana. We could also say base, based, and support, because alambana itself means a support, so it's a little difficult to translate these terms because they kind of overlap. The difference, I'll try to explain the difference between ashraya and alambana through some example, so you can understand the difference between basis or support in the first sense and what has been translated as object. A basis is something like, or an ashraya is something like the table for this. You see what it does? I put it here and it supports it. An alambana is more like, the example given by Vasubandhu is a stick for an elderly person to arise. It's something that we actively cling to. So there is this alam means to kind of cling from something, to hang from something. So when an elderly person needs to rise, sometimes they need to do this. That object is called alambana. This type of object is called ashraya. So when there is a case of visual consciousness, the eye is like the table, and the object of the eye is like that that stuff that the elderly person might use. So the consciousness is something like the elderly person. That's the difference. There's a slight difference. So here he gives the example that the supports are all the various elements, the eye, etc., etc. And the supported is consciousness. What they support is consciousness. And the objects are the various objects like visual form, etc. Okay. Why do we give this order? why do we have this order of objects and elements of consciousness? He says because for the first five, the object is fixed, while the object of the mind is not fixed. The mind can take any object. The eye cannot take a sound as an object. The ear cannot take physical form as an object. But the mind can take its own special objects as well as any other object. The mind can take sound, it can take a visual form, anything as its object. So its object is not fixed, is not restricted. It doesn't have a restricted or specific object. So that's why it is last. And also, clearer way to explain it maybe is the past, present, and future. There is a restriction in terms of time. The eye consciousness can only perceive something present. I can only hear a sound which is a present sound. I cannot hear with my ear consciousness a past sound. But the mind can take as an object even something past or think of something future. So it doesn't have restriction in terms of the three times. Now, why do we have the eye, ear, nose, and tongue before the body? Because, okay, you have to think why he's asking this question. If we even think about the order, the position, the body element is everywhere. Remember, when we say body here, we're referring to the faculty that allows us to have touch. So it's everywhere. It's distributed throughout the body. So we could very well start with that rather than with the eye. But the explanation is because the object of the body is derived matter and it is not fixed. Sometimes it is a primary element, sometimes it is derived from the primary element, sometimes both. Yes, no, the transition is not too good. Anyways, the point that he's making is that there is a special feature, actually this is something you don't know yet, about Rupa. Rupa is divided into two, more basically, which he didn't really elaborate upon. There is basic form. Basic form is the four great elements. The four great elements are earth element, water element, fire element, and wind element. And this doesn't refer to when we look and we see water. It refers to very subtle entities which have certain type of characteristics. For example, the characteristic of the earth element is hardness, kakkadatva. And these very subtle, small entities which have this characteristic of hardness are responsible for our having a table being hard and capable of supporting other things. The table is not only made of that, but those elements which are responsible for the table performing that function are the earth elements, and so forth. There are also derived forms. Derived form is derived from these basic elements, and it includes many of the objects of touch, such as coolness, heat, what causes hunger, what causes thirst, harshness, smoothness. All of these are derived form. Also, our faculties are considered to be derived form. So, touch is unfixed. Visible form, so the eye can only perceive derived form. It cannot perceive the great elements. The great elements are not visible. What is visible is called visible form and is derived from them, but we never can see the great elements. So the eye only sees derived form. Same thing for the ear, same thing for the nose, same thing for the tongue. But what we touch is a mixture. It doesn't have that restriction. We can also touch the four great elements, we just cannot see them. And then we have the derived form, which we can also touch. So that's one reason to have the body later. The eye and the ear are given first, that's another reason, because their objects are farther than nose and tongue. You can see something from far before you smell it or before you can taste it. You can hear something from far, so its object is farther. If something is even 1 kilometer from here, if it's a loud noise, I can hear it. But probably if there is something 1 kilometer from here, I don't think I can smell it, I don't think I can taste it. So there is a difference. And between the two, the range of activity of the eye is more extensive than the one of the ear. We can see farther than we can hear. Simple thing, people, when they speak, usually you can see people even very, very far, even when you cannot hear them. The nose is before the tongue because its activity is faster. What do they mean? If we have food, we can already smell it even before we taste it. Another reason is, once again, what I said, the position in the body. The eye is at the top, the ear is here, etc. Most of the body is here. That's the reason. Most of the body is below. So, and the mind is dependent on them, but it stands without any place of its own. So the mind doesn't have a specific location. Now we have the actual definition of each of them. What is the eye? When we say the eye is a sensitive or clear rupa. It's called rupa prasada, the clarity of rupa. And it performs the act of seeing form in the sense that it produces a visual consciousness. It is the main cause for a visual consciousness. So we're referring to this special type of rupa which is somewhere in our eye, and that is the main cause for the arising of the visual consciousness. The ear and the others should be understood more or less in the same way, meaning rupa prasada placed in different parts of our body. Okay, when we say dhatu, what does it mean? It means something like family or lineage or point of origin, gotra, but it means something like an ore. He said family or lineage, but it's more like an ore or a mine. So in the mountains there are many mines, and in these mines you will find some ores. Like you find a place from which you can get gold again and again. That's the meaning of dhatu. So mines of ore are called families, gotra. Then what do they answer for? Extract from these mines mind and mental states. So this is another example. There is a slightly different explanation, but here the explanation is that when you have the eye and you have visible form, this is the mine from which you can keep on mining visual consciousness. Okay, so this is the explanation of the elements. Now the last category is the 12 entrances. Sense fields is not really a good translation. I'm sorry that he used it. because we are not talking about senses necessarily, it includes the mind. So I'm not sure that sense fields is a very good idea. But let's read first the Sanskrit. Tatra Bhikshavaha Tatamani Dvadasha Ayatanani Tadyatha Chakshuradhyatmikam Ayatanam Rupam Bahyam Ayatanam. Sorry, this is a mistake. It should be Ayatanam. Ah, wrong ah. Shrotram Adhyatmikam Ayatanam. Shabdo Bahyam Ayatanam. Ghranam Adhyatmikam Ayatanam. Gandho Bahyam Ayatanam. Jihva Adhyatmikam Ayatanam. Raso Bahyam Ayatanam. Kaya Adhyatmikam Ayatanam. Sparsho Bahyam Ayatanam. Mana Adhyatmikam Ayatanam. Dharmo Bahyam Ayatanam. Imani Bhikshava Uchyante Dvadasha Ayatanani. This is what we read earlier in a different order and with some words added. Earlier we just read 12 words, and the way the list was organized was that first you have the outer ayatanas, all 6, and then the inner ones, or vice versa. Now first the inner and then the outer. This one, on the other hand, lists one inner and one outer. One inner and one outer. And it says it. Adhyatmika means belonging to a self, belonging to oneself, and Bahya means outer. So this is how this list differs. So, mentally substitute entrance rather than sense field, but this is the translation. So, there is an interesting question here. We said there is no self. So what do you mean belonging to the self? We usually translate as inner or internal, but that way we lose the problem. Actually in Sanskrit and Pali is adhyatmika, or a similar word in Pali, and it includes the word atma or atta. So you said there is no self, how can this make any sense? That's the objection. The answer is, yes, there is no self, but people who believe in a self, when they imagine a self, what they're referring to is the mind. So, what they use, what they really refer to, and what is the basis for them to make this kind of misconstruction is the mind. So the mind is the basis for this to happen, and therefore, as a kind of metaphor, we call the mind self. So there are other cases, other famous cases where this is done by the Buddha himself. This is what Vasubandhu points out. For example, in the Udana Varga, which the Pali version is called Dhammapada, it is said, you should tame yourself by yourself. Tame yourself by yourself. So what does the Buddha mean when he says that? Elsewhere we see that he speaks about taming the mind. So we know that when he's referring to tame yourself by yourself means you have to tame your mind. The word self refers to your mind. So we can use the word self as a kind of approximative way of talking, referring to the mind. That is the point which is made. So we shouldn't worry too much when we say the entrances belonging to the self. Okay. We have already explained the I, etc., when we were explaining the basis, the dhatus. So now he's going to focus on the objects. So the object, visible form, is of two types, color and shape. Some people believe that both of them exist. Some people believe that it's just the arrangement of colors which gives rise to the concept of shape. So there's two opinions about that. Sound is of two types. It can be caused by elements which have been appropriated. He says upatta as present. That's wrong. Upatta means appropriated or clung to. So I'll give you'll understand immediately what it means. My hand is called upatta. It is appropriated by my consciousness. So that's why it belongs to my own continuum. But this table is not appropriated. So if I make a sound with my hands or with speech, that is considered to be caused by appropriated rupa, appropriated great element. If I make a sound, or if there is a sound like that fan, that is non-appropriated. That's a difference. So that's not the type of form that my consciousness is clinging to. That's a difference. Then smell is of three types, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. Taste is of 6 kinds, sweet, sour, salty, pungent, bitter, and astringent. This is common description in Indian medicine too. 6 types of flavor. They also have to do with medicine. You know that traditional medicine has primarily to do with food. Recognize which foods are healthy, and one does it also by their taste. And the tangible, what we can touch, is of 11 types. The primary elements, so earth, water, fire, and wind, not air, wind. And also softness, hardness, heaviness, lightness, cold, hunger, and thirst. When we say hunger and thirst, it's not literal. It doesn't refer to a feeling. A feeling is not part of rupa. A feeling is part of vedana. But we're referring to that kind of form which is the cause for our hunger and thirst. So something in our body is the cause for our feeling of hunger and thirst. That is what we call here hunger and thirst. We're not referring to a mental attitude. Objects of the mind, the dharma dhatu, consist of feeling, perception, compositional factors, space. Space is one of the uncompounded or non-produced factors. Cessation through analysis, pratisankhya nirodha. That means when we make our mental defilements cease because we reflect on the Four Noble Truths. Cessation that does not depend on analysis, any other case of cessation, where something ceases because the causes and conditions are not there, naturally, without our applying analysis. These are considered to be non-produced dharmas. Real dharmas, non-produced dharmas, permanent dharmas, these three. They are included in the dharma dhatu. So what do we mean by ayatana? We already explained the meaning of skandha, the meaning of dhatu. What does ayatana mean? It means a gate or entryway for the arising of mind and mental derivatives. And also, it is sometimes explained that they extend or they stretch the arising of mind and mental states. It's a similar meaning actually. So it's either entrances or things which extend the coming of mind and mental states. So this is the basic explanation of Skandha Dhatu and Ayatana. I know this for you maybe sounds very long and elaborate, but this is one of the shortest you can get. This is a very short. Actually, in Chinese, there are some treatises which explain this well too. What I should introduce among the various things that maybe you're not familiar with is the 5 realities. These also will help us understand the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika perspective on the skandhas. The Sarvastivada Vidharma is based on the Panchavastu, the 5 realities. So there are 5 classes of entities which are real entities according to Vaibhashika. What are they? Rupa, so visible form. Chitta, so mind. Chitta Samprayukta Samskara, so formations associated with the mind, also called Chaita, so mental states. Chitta Viprayukta Samskara, so formations disassociated from the mind. And the Asamskata. Asamskatas are the non-produced dharmas, and 3 of them. Space, which is just non-obstruction, and the 2 types of cessation. These are all the dharmas which exist for the Vaibhashika. The Sautrantika don't believe in the last 2 categories. They don't believe that there are formations disassociated from the mind, and they don't believe that there are non-produced dharmas. What they believe is that when we say space, it's just the absence of something else. When we say cessation, it only means that something else has stopped to be there. So it's just an aim. So in that respect, they have a different idea. But this system of 5 realities in Vaibhashika is coordinated to explain the 5 skandhas. So the explanation that you got is also coordinated with that. So my suggestion would be, if you want to understand this better, you will need to read it a few times. I'm aware. When it is the first time you hear about the aggregates, bases and entrances, it's not easy to remember everything and put it nicely together. So you have to read it a few times. And also you can read other things that help you. My suggestion would be, read this book and read another book by Venerable Dhammajoti, which is called Abhidharma Avatara by Skandila. It's an introduction to Abhidharma by Skandila, which is translated very nicely. It's in about 50 pages, around 50 pages. It's not so long. If you can read Chinese, then you can read those treatises in Chinese too, and also the Panchavastuka. But otherwise, you can read these translations in English, and slowly you can put things together. Because if you're not used to think in terms of Abhidharma, it takes some time. Abhidharma also is present in the sutras. So there is something about the method of exposition which is what may cause you some difficulty. So now we still have 1 hour, I think. And now, apart from revising a bit what we read, I want to try to explain you a little bit how this method of exposition works, so that maybe slowly you can become more acquainted and you will face less problems. Abhidharma is based on the idea that realities, real entities, have got certain features or defining traits. They're called Lakshana or Lakkana in Pali. And therefore, most of Abhidharma is giving you these defining traits. It looks like just a list of definitions. In one sense, that is what it is. So first of all, it gives you definitions which do not take into account progression through time. It just lists the entities that exist, just like we studied now. Then it starts discussing what happens through time. So how causal processes happen, how different entities arise, even in terms of long spans of time, like from one life to the next. So first it gives you the basic elements which are involved, and then it explains the causal relationships and how these causal relationships progress through time. So in that sense also this is the ABC, because what then Abhidharma will do is give you how these elements interact to give rise to all our experiences. In fact, the next topic in this sutra is dependent arising in 12 parts. That explains the whole process of samsara. How are we going to understand that whole process though if we don't know this? Because what he's going to say will presuppose that we're already familiar with this. They will use similar terminology and explain the terms used there through these terms. So when you study the 12 parts of dependent arising, it's something you might be paradoxically more familiar with. Actually, it's based on this. If we don't have an idea about this, we cannot really understand it well. It's actually quite simple if you reflect on it. Nama Rupa, you read about Nama Rupa. But we have no idea what is Nama, no idea what is Rupa. In that context, it refers to specific stages of Nama Rupa. But of course, usually the explanation is given in another context. So, once you understand this, learning about dependent arising through time is the next step. You understand this principle. It's more difficult because you have to know the elements and you have to understand how they interact causally. So the explanations become a little bit more complex. If you don't obtain clarity about this level, then the next level, you just heap up doubts and heap up obscurity in your mind. It becomes all very foggy. You end up having just a very vague idea of everything. So, we have to remember that these texts, although they look very short, they are meant to be read many times. The lists are meant to be memorized. So, when we understand this, one thing that you can do is to chant them many times. Just the lists. You chant the list and then read again and again. Slowly, it becomes easier. You see, even this very brief passage that we read, one of the reasons why you might get lost is that very often it refers to a list that you're supposed to already have in your mind. It says the I, etc. And if you don't have the list in your mind, at that point you get lost. When it says the I, etc. is the eye and the glasses, the eye and my haircut, what is it? You don't know the list? No idea. Why did he say etc.? Oh, I don't care much. Doesn't matter. That must be an irrelevant detail. Actually, no. It's a very important detail. It's just they say etc. because they expect the readers or students to be very careful. And they say, since the principle is the same, you yourself apply to all the other skandhas or all the other ayatanas. Same like the Art Sutra. Actually, what the Art Sutra means is, now this you have to do yourself. I said Rupam Shunyata Shunyateva Rupam. Your turn is to say Vedana Shunyata Shunyateva Vedana, Samnya Shunyata Shunyateva Samnya, Samskara shunyata, shunyateva samskara, vijnanam shunyata, shunyateva vijnanam. You should understand that it applies to all of them in the same way. Rupa is just the example. The others are equally important. Actually more important. Strictly speaking, from the Buddhist Mahayana point of view, the emphasis is not on the emptiness of Rupa skandha, if you think about it. So, if we don't know this list, we lose direction. Some things we only catch very vaguely, and we miss on some things that sometimes are very important. Even in cases of very key texts, which we might have heard many times. So slowly, when we read Buddhist texts, we should remember that this is a system based on memory. It's based on at least memorizing a few things well, remembering what are the definition of the 5 skandhas. Rupa is the 4 great elements and what is derived from it. What is the definition of Vedana? Vedana is experience of 3 types. What is the definition of Samnya, notion? It means to perceive a sign. What's the definition of Samskara? Samskara are all the other co-producing factors. What's the definition of Vijnana? Vijnana is perceiving an object, just the mere perception of an object, seeing a reference. So, these kind of very brief definitions are brief, but they're crucial. If you know them, then it's much easier to understand everything in Buddhism. Even if you just remember that Nama does not stay in any place. Vijnana or consciousness is just perceiving an object. If you know this much, if you can't remember just this much, your way of reading Buddhist text, any type of Buddhist text, changes completely compared to if you don't know it. If when you read the word consciousness in a Buddhist text, you think of, I have a consciousness, inside my consciousness many thoughts occur. And this is what you think is consciousness. Then you have missed the whole explanation. Because that's not the meaning. When they say vijnana, they're referring to just the mere perception of the object. If you think that when they say consciousness, you think, oh, this is some kind of, I don't know, electricity happening in my brain or something like that, like Frankenstein, then you got totally wrong. Then you missed the whole thing. But that's a problem. When we use English, sometimes we associate a meaning that we are already familiar with. But that might not be the meaning that is used in the Buddhist text. To know that meaning, if you learn the Skanda Dhatu and Ayatana, it's great. They're like, if you learn this, like if you chant this many, many times, you're a little bit like Karate Kid. That he just does like this, it's only 2 movements, but he can beat anyone. So it's the same thing. That's the basis. It's like, it's very few things, but if you know them well, you have a key to understand everything else and it becomes clearer. So, if it seems that it's difficult, it's partly because you're not used to this style of exposition. Also, very often when we study about Buddhism, we only read secondary sources. You might be reading very often some academic book about the skandhas, which gives you a more discursive explanation. But we are not used to even read the translations of a Buddhist text. This we don't do enough, in my opinion. That will give you a different flavor, which you are not used to. And one thing is, you have to read them slower. Even if you're reading a translation, you have to read it quite slow. Sometimes you have to stop and think a little bit, digest it, then read it again after some days, and again try to chant and memorize something. All of this will help you. So my point, partly, is to introduce a different type of learning. Or maybe you already do it, I don't know, I'm just assuming. But since I noticed that maybe you're facing some difficulty, my impression is you're not used to this kind of text. So if you're not used to this kind of text, try to slowly become acquainted with this kind of text. And this is a different art of learning. It's more patient. When you read a more discursive explanation, you might feel that, oh yeah, I caught the idea. But maybe it's a slightly diluted idea. That's one point. Second point is, if it is presented in such a way that you don't remember the shorter point, like consciousness is just a perception of the object, it doesn't do you much good. Because even if you understand the point then and there, and it looks like it makes sense, next time, after 1 week, you read again the word consciousness, you've forgotten. And again you think, oh, it's the brain. So everything gone. So, when you read this, my suggestion is, read it many times, chant a little bit, when you can, try to chant, in Sanskrit or Pali or whatever. In this case, if you're interested in this text, Sanskrit is better. The part that I would recommend you to chant for this is not this part actually, just these 3 sentences. You see, Panchaskandaha, Rupam, Vedana. If you chant these, for example, it's 1 sentence. This sentence is made of 7 words. These 7 words can change your own understanding of Buddhism. I know it's a big claim, but I'm trying to make some advertisement. So, but it's a bit true in the sense that if you can remember these words and slowly recognize when somebody is using different translations but referring back to these 5 words, you see, you have a fixed point of reference which allow you not to get confused. It's the one point of reference which will be common to all the different translations that you will encounter. If you only know translations, you don't have that. So you see the advantage. So if you just chant that sentence, already it helps. So this would be my suggestion, to chant this part. Not the first part was just to give you an idea of how a sutra looks dealing with the skandha on ayatana. But this is the part which could help you. So, now, if you have some questions, you could ask some questions.
Yeah, I use the term entities.
Entities, yes.
What do you mean?
Existent things. Existent things.
Dhammas?
It's one of the synonyms of dharma. So dharma can have many different meanings. One meaning of dharma is bhava, and bhava means an entity. A really existent thing is a dharma. The definition of dharma is that which has its own characteristic, as opposed to something that we imagine. So it actually has a characteristic we are not imagining. So a table, in that case, would not be a dharma as treated in the Abhidharma. The dharmas which make up a table are the great elements and what is derived from the great elements. They come together as a collection, changing moment by moment. Each of them is momentary. We don't recognize all that. We just recognize a unitary entity and we have this concept of table. So when we have Abhidharma, we start recognizing that the table is not one thing. So we see the table and we know that what we see falls into the category visible form. So the characteristic that we learned about visible form helps us recognizing that one part of the table is visible form. If we touch the table, what we are touching is actually another set of entities. They fall under something different. They fall under touchables. If we make a sound, that falls under sound, which is a type of derived form. So slowly we recognize that we had initially thought of this as a unitary entity, but it's not. By learning those categories, we know that the idea of the unitary entity comes from our memory and our habituation. So we have different types of perceptions which actually relate to sets of different objects. And then we just put a label onto that. So this is what the Abhidharma is for. Like when we think of a person, it's the same thing. Our sense of a person is the same thing. If we analyze, what we have is something which belongs to Rupa. So we have atoms of the four great elements, like the earth element is what allows our body to hold up. The heat element is what makes for temperature, etc., etc. Then we have Vedana, feelings. We have all these feelings arising, like pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, which are associated to our experiences. And then we have some notions. We have constantly lots of notions which relate to these objects. Whenever we encounter an object, we make a notion. As soon as we enter a room and we see, maybe we see people, then we have the many notions about people being here and there. Different colors. We have notion of white, bright, dark, a clock, board, a computer. All these are notions, but they're more than we can ever be aware of. We have so many notions coming up. And then we have some attitudes, like, oh, I like it, I don't like it, I'm indifferent. It's something, oh, that's very attractive, no, this is boring, or anything. All of these are some kind of attitudes of our mind. Sometimes we understand something clearly, that's also an attitude of the mind. So, and then we have the mind, which is just moments of bare perception, on which everything else is based. Just the basis for everything else which I mentioned to be there. So actually there's a lot going on. But we have this concept that what's happening is very simple. There is one entity entering in another place, a clear-cut entity, a person, and I'm perceiving other persons. We don't distinguish between all these layers of our experience. So when we learn the characteristics of dharmas in Abhidharma, we start distinguishing. We start understanding why we have the sense that we are in a certain place. We might think that even our mind is in a certain place. And so slowly, we start understanding that this is not so. The body is in a certain place, the mind doesn't have any location. So you see, this is undoing our idea of a unitary person. Also, we start seeing that all of this is impermanent. Once we subdivide all these entities and all these experiences, we see more and more that they are impermanent, that they're actually constantly changing. Our field of perception is constantly changing. We just don't notice because we have in mind the entities. You see, if in my mind I identify any of you as one person, then I just think that there's one person who's continuing to stay there. If I don't do that, even just the fact that you move a bit makes for a different thing. It's a different set of entity. All the experience is completely different. And the whole field of vision that we have, we don't notice all this change all the time. But every moment is constantly changing. So this is what we can learn by learning this Abhidharma. And of course, one of the points of shamatha is that a friend of mine, I think he explained it as a kind of magnifier for time. it's like time slows down, but not really. It's just that we start noticing smaller and smaller units of time. That allows us to understand change better. In some texts, it is said that perceiving things as momentary is a result of understanding selflessness. Because when we think of a unitary entity, we disregard the moment-to-moment differences. So if, on the other hand, we study the aggregates, let's say, and we lose that addition, that conceptual addition in our mind, that there is a unitary person, then we start perceiving momentariness. We don't impute identity to two consecutive moments. So it can change one's perception completely. That's the idea. In the beginning is a type of reasoning, and also, as Venerable Borgeno said, in daily life it's hard to apply, but this is true up to a point, in the sense that still we are putting some kind of bug in our ear. At least we start being less convinced. And that's the purpose. Then if one becomes more convinced of the explanations of the Abhidharma, then we are supposed to have this kind, at least that is what is said in the Buddhist text. This is what we also just read. We read that the purpose is mainly to undo this perception of a self. And perception of a self means perceiving something as being permanent and independent from causes and conditions, non-contingent. So for example, when we think of ourselves as a person, we think that we are there from the moment we are born to the moment we die. It continues, and maybe even for longer. And maybe we were there even before. Even if we were to cut our name, we still exist. Okay, what if I cut this part of my finger? What if I cut this much? What if I cut this much? When does it stop? So even if we think in that way, you can see that there is something arbitrary. There is no clear cut. When we cut our hair, we don't feel that we have lost part of ourselves. We cut another part of our body, depends. We can change, but still we can feel that nothing has happened. So you see, there is something very strange about the way we identify with things. Like, if I remove my earwax, I don't feel like my personality has been diminished. If I blow my nose, I'm pretty okay. But if somebody told me that they want to cut my nose, I'd feel differently about it. Although, if I saw my nose after it has been cut, after some time, after a while I don't feel anymore this feeling that it's mine. It could be anybody's nose, maybe. So, you can, when you start thinking about the parts on the whole, and you think, why do I get this sense of identity about things? You start removing piece by piece, and you start thinking, when exactly do I lose that sense of identity about this thing? It's quite interesting, because you won't find easily one clear-cut point. Like even if you have a table, when do you stop calling it a table? Okay, I destroy one leg. Is it still a table? Yes, kind of. 2 legs? Maybe not, because it can't stand. So, when do we stop? Even if I have all the pieces but I rearrange them, is it still a table or not? So where was the table to begin with? If we think in that way, at one point we start thinking, oh, I was just used to think it's a table because every time I see that shape, I know we use it as a table, and I get that idea. But if we never reflect in this way, when we go somewhere, we see that shape, we think that, oh, there is a table there. That's not a name occurring somewhere in my mind stream. That's something that it is out there. And it's the same thing for the five aggregates. If we start becoming acquainted with the idea that now a feeling has a reason, we don't think it's my feeling, but we just observe a feeling as a reason. We have an attitude towards it as if it had happened to somebody else. When we have that attitude, then it completely changes, of course. So that's what is the purpose of this. To slowly give us more tools to analyze all our perceptions. And that's why I made this kind of not very smart example of Karate Kid. Because the point is, these are few elements. We just read a couple of pages, but they're supposed to be applied to all our perceptions. So that's why one should read them many times. Many times reflect, what really do we mean by Rupa Skanda? How can I recognize Rupa Skanda slowly? And the analysis of whole and parts usually helps. We start to understand that, okay, like a person, it's a very remarkable thing. If you start thinking about the body, even the body is the name for a collection. Strictly speaking, there is no body. Body is an idea. So if one starts observing this entity called body, where is it exactly? Is it in my left ear or is it in my right foot? So where is it exactly? And we start searching, usually we don't find that kind of entity. So we can do it in an easier way, but when we do it with the Abhidharma, according to the Buddhist tradition, it is a bit more genuine and it becomes more subtle. So it becomes more effective. We have a better tool. And this tool was taught by the Buddha with very specific mental problems of the disciples in mind. So it can cater to many different types of difficulties that we might have in understanding selflessness.
In the beginning you said about 18 phases.
Yes.
Based on dependent arising, and you said about the causality. These two terms. Can you explain the terms of dependent arising and the causality?
Okay. Causality, well, this is a problem of English. Causality just means the relationship between cause and effect. And this can be explained in many different ways. The Buddhist way to explain causality is dependent arising. There's other ways to explain causality which are not accepted by the Buddhists. So the Buddhists accept that anything which arises to an assemblage of causes and conditions, and not just one. You need always at least a minimum of two causes and conditions for something to arise. So dependent arising means the arising of anything based on causes and conditions. That's the meaning of dependent arising. When we say causality, it can cover other explanations of causality as well. Like, for example, people who believe in a creator God. They think that God is the cause of the universe. That's a different explanation of causality. So the term is, one is a broader term, and one is specifically referring to the Buddhist explanation of causality. In terms of dependent arising, I think there are two main ways in the Buddhist tradition in which one explains dependent arising. One is to explain the arising of one moment of consciousness. The other one is to explain how consciousness works through different lifetimes. The explanation of the arising of one moment of consciousness is like this in the 18 bases. When there is the object and the support, so visible form and the eye, visual consciousness arises. This destroys the idea that there is a fixed perceiver. There is no fixed perceiver, but there is a continuity of different types of consciousness in alternation, which come about due to causes and conditions. And the other type is the explanation of the 12 limbs of dependent arising. That explains how consciousness continues through time, like the continuum of moment of consciousness continues through different lifetimes, due to the process, due to karma and klesha, due to the karma and mental defilements. So, this is the Buddhist explanation of causality. It's not shared by non-Buddhists. The way in which also we come to these conclusions is different. Like Buddhist philosophers analyze causality, and this, I know that it's very common to say that Buddhism is perfectly compatible with science. It's very similar approach, etc., etc. While there might be some ways to make some type of scientific approach partly compatible with Buddhism, it's not always so smooth. At least we should understand that the principles are not always the same. One example is this. What do we consider to be the most valuable data? This is one of the biggest differences. And how we interpret it. This is the second biggest difference. First difference is this. In modern science, the most valuable data is the data which is collected by ordinary persons who do not necessarily have a special type of mind training. The main point is that it must be shared perception, possibly repeatable. It has to be shareable and repeatable and measurable. Measurable usually with some kind of numbers. And in fact, the data is then interpreted largely through mathematical models, through numbers. So, one does not give much weight to what they would call introspective data, the things that are private to your own mind. That doesn't have much role in scientific observation, usually, at least for the hard sciences. In the Buddhist tradition, it's kind of the opposite. What's the most reliable type of data? It's data that cannot be shared and that can only be perceived by the mind, not even by the eye, not by the ear. It could never be measured by a machine. Even people who do vipassana, what they see as being the real momentary dharmas are not seen with the eye, they're seen with the mind. So there's no question of shareable data. There's no question of making an experiment. And it has to be someone who has a mind in samadhi. That has more value. That's the basis for many of the description. It's the opposite. You see? It's in one way it's opposite mentality. One is about it has to be shared, and actually I have to say it's not entirely true what they say. It's not really shared, strictly speaking, because it's shared only among a handful of experts. who have a very specific training that most people have no way to check. And most people don't even have a chance to be given tools to reflect on whether that kind of experimentation is really accurate, whether there is some problem in using, as I was saying earlier, numbers to measure reality, which is a philosophical problem, so it's extra scientific, it's beyond the scientific method, it's about philosophy of science. So, there might be something similar, we might think, but we also should remember there's something very different. The experience of a yogi who has got samadhi for the Buddhist tradition has a different weight. And also, another very big difference is the Buddhist tradition doesn't have the idea that the primary data is the one which is visible by the senses. Objects of the mind are just as existent. The mind as well, not having location in space, so not being measurable in any way, no problem. Why should that not be existent? Why should we have this kind of bias that what exists has to be in some place? This is, for most people now, this is also strange to hear. But in ancient India, the people who believed that the mind is derived from the elements got all sorts of insults for being stupid. They were called cows and animals. There was that philosophical system, but all the other systems refuted them very quickly and said, okay, we can kind of ignore them because that's so foolish. That sounds so senseless. So this is incredible if you think about it. In the past, for people to think that the mind was derived from matter or could be reduced to matter was completely counterintuitive. They thought, this is so strange. How could somebody even think this? And they pointed out all the mistakes from their perspective. So in other words, it was considered just, most people thought that's not a good idea at all. It's just a very strange idea. And those were a minority, very small minority of philosophers who thought that way. And they really usually got insults. But it's quite funny. But in Buddhist texts, sometimes there's some kind of humor, so people insult each other a little bit. But also, they were considered to be non-virtuous. It's considered the worst type of non-virtue. Nagarjuna says, Astikas go to Sugati, and Nastikas go to bad rebirth, Niraya, which means kind of hell. Astika means those who believe that there is a permanent self. So, from the Buddhist point of view, it is said quite openly, it's 100 times better to think that there is a permanent self, or a God creator, or whatever, than to think that the mind comes from matter and it ceases at death. That's the worst type of wrong view. This is said again and again. Worst type of wrong view is to think that everything comes from Rupa. It's emphasized a lot. But this part, many people don't know. So, it's quite common that people think that being materialist and being Buddhist is perfectly compatible, no problem. But you can check what the Buddhist texts say. Both the sutras and the shastras. You find this both in the sutras. So both, whether it's Pali or Sanskrit or Chinese, you can find it. And the shastras. The shastras then become more and more explicit on this point. So that's the other useful thing of Abhidharma. I think in modern times, that's one reason why Abhidharma is so useful. Okay, getting rid of yourself is one level, very high level, but even more basic problem is offering a perspective which is not a materialist perspective. And Buddhist philosophy is not a materialist philosophy. It's not based on the idea that the primary causes of everything are material form. This is not Buddhist philosophy. So, in that respect, Abhidharma helps a lot because it gives explanations of the causality of mind. How, in fact, mind can even have causality in terms of matter, like the place where we live, etc., through karma. Yes?
Dr. Bhattash, since you touched on the selflessness, I had a question I hope you can answer. The fundamental schools of Vaibhasikas and the Sautrantikas, they believe in the cause and the subtle selflessness of the person.
Yes.
But they don't accept the selflessness of the phenomenon.
Yes.
Yet, they believe in the four seals. It seems contradictory.
I heard this before, and actually I heard this even to make a slightly, in my opinion, unconvincing claim. I've had some Theravada friends saying that we also believe in selflessness of dharmas because sabbe dhamma anatta. So that means we believe in selflessness of dharmas. But they don't understand what the word selflessness of dharma means. When we use the word selflessness of Pudgala, we mean that there is no identity in terms of a person. So, and we can apply that, this type of selflessness, also to the dharmas. So if I say, sarve dharmaha anatmana, all the dharmas are without a self, I mean a self in the sense of a person, in the sense of a permanent core that continues over and above the dharmas. So there is no contradiction. When I say selflessness of dharmas in the Mahayana sense, dharmanairatmya, it means something else. It means the dharmas themselves not only lack a permanent core over and above them, but they themselves are an illusion. So it's a different sense of the word nairatmya. So there is no contradiction actually. The Mahayana philosophers point out that actually the Buddha taught both types of selflessness even in the non-Mahayana sutras, but not extensively. But not all the Shravakas understood it. So their form of Abhidharma is based on understanding only one level of selflessness. But I don't think it's contradictory. It's just, you have to think in this way. Before the distinction between Pudgala Nairatmya and Dharma Nairatmya was set forth, there was only one type of Nairatmya. So if I know only one type of Nairatmya, of selflessness, and I say all dharmas are selfless, then you cannot say that I'm contradicting myself because you introduce another sense of the word selflessness and I don't want to apply it. You understand what I mean? I use the word selflessness in a specific sense, meaning there is no permanent person in the five skandhas, and that's what I mean. Then I'm free to say all this applies to all dharmas, so I say sabbe dhamma anatta in Pali. Fine, where is the contradiction? Then you come and you tell me that there is one more meaning of selflessness, but I don't accept it. I think that's actually wrong. That's a wrong explanation. So how do I incur a contradiction by not applying that? It's a wrong explanation. So no problem from the perspective of Vaibhashika and Sautrantika. From their perspective, there is no contradiction. So I might have my own philosophical preferences, but one thing I have to say, when we study a system, it's better to try to see how it makes sense first. Later, we have time to see how it doesn't make sense. We can reflect, but the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika masters were extremely intelligent people. Their philosophy is very sophisticated. So unfortunately now, sometimes we don't take it too seriously. Like, I'm not saying that you're doing that, that's not what I mean. But I noticed that sometimes we already heard about Yogacara and Madhyamaka, so we start thinking, oh, this is so much subtler. So that means these people were a bit thick. They did not. So, but actually sometimes we cannot even understand the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika. So that's a sign that maybe we also misunderstood Yogacara and Madhyamaka. And we are making them small. If you think about it. If Yogacara and Madhyamaka are higher, let's assume, than Vaibhashika and Sautrantika, that's a great thing if Vaibhashika and Sautrantika are here. But if Vaibhashika and Sautrantika are there, and we say they are higher, that might mean that they're just here. Like, if you tell me that I am taller than a horse, it's one thing. If you tell me that you're much taller than an ant, I could be a very short person. So, it's the same thing here. If we don't appreciate Vaibhashika and Sautrantika very much, then we don't see very well the value of Yogacara and Madhyamaka. And also, many Madhyamaka masters and Yogacara masters incorporated a lot of Vaibhashika and Sautrantika in their view of valid conventions. So it is part of their system. They appreciated it very much. They just thought, okay, many of these things are great, but in our tradition we think there is something more. And here it is, which is the Dharma, the sequences of dharmas. But okay, that was a tangent. Yes?
We have 4 Arupa ran within the 21 plane, and I understand this 4 Arupa world is still within the samsara, right? So my question is, how cleaning of the 5 aggregate fit into this Arupa world, since Arupa world there's no form?
In fact, there's 2 opinions about that. Some say that the Arupya Dhatu is with a very subtle type of form. And some say that there's no 5 aggregates, only 4. So in that case, you still can analyze that there is no person by using 4 aggregates rather than 5. So there's these 2 possible solutions.
Okay, another question is, what is Buddhist view on the theory of evolution? Because my question is, when you look at Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, are they classified as animals or human?
Probably human, because according to the Buddhist cosmology also, humans changed. But the Buddhist theory is the opposite. Is that humans used to be taller, and they're becoming shorter, and in future become very, very short. So the Buddhist theory is not a Buddhist of evolution, is a theory of devolution. We start from being, and the reason is that the idea is that in the beginning they had less defilements, and then the defilements went worse and worse. Now, different solutions to that. There's some people who say, doesn't matter, we don't take it too literally, and we believe in evolution. Fine. Other people say, you're really not taking seriously the Buddhist text, you should give them a chance. So, we believe in evolution, why? Because we only study evolution. We don't know the other explanation, what is its basis. So, which one makes sense? It's hard to tell. And there's another point. From the perspective of Mahayana, that's an interesting, different perspective. It's like, is the earth flat or is the earth spheric? Could be different answers, but one answer is that neither of them. Because from a certain perspective, there is no real common object of perception. Perception depends from the background of our own mind stream. So a certain group of people could perceive the same object in a completely different way from another group of people. So this does not go very well with the idea that we are going to have a very clear-cut explanation of everything that happened in the universe before now. But again, if we don't just read about what scientists say, but we study a little bit of philosophy of science, we see that there too it becomes more problematic. When you start touching on the foundation of science, then it's not that clear-cut and it doesn't look that objective, so to speak. So, how to fit evolution? That my suggestion would be, maybe you can read what the Buddhist stories are about how the universe came about, etc. And you see it's totally different. And then you can struggle to put it together. I think it's not easy. You see, we would like to have a very easy way, but everything fits together. All the parts of our life are perfectly coherent. What I've been taught when I was small, and now I learned Buddhist philosophy, everything is going to match. But I'm afraid sometimes it doesn't work. Buddhism and what was taught in the sutras, etc., we have to remember, comes from a pre-scientific era. If we are so convinced that science is the best of the best, then maybe we're not really interested in Buddhism. If we think that everything we can know about reality, the best way is science, maybe we should study science, not Buddhism. I'm afraid it's true. Buddhism will find many things that don't fit very well with that kind of mentality. So for example, what I was saying earlier, what yogis perceive just by their mind, from a scientific point of view has no value. Zero. The only value is that somebody comes and puts some kind of wire on the head and then they draw some drawing somewhere. It's nothing. It doesn't mean that the yogi, they're not checking what the yogi perceived and its value. They're checking what they can perceive about the yogi. That's all they're interested in. So that's the kind of interaction. It's like people completely talking at odds. Then no interest about what the yogi, is it real? No interest. We just want to know what happens to his brain. So they give it no value. If you think about it, it's no value about the yogi's cognition, except for possible health benefits. That's a maximum. Will it make us a little relaxed and more efficient at the workplace? Then let's go measure a yogi. But that would also go for the Buddha. It's amazing if you think about it. You could have even now some people somewhere who have very, very high realization. But if somebody has that idea about science, all they will be interested is, okay, but how is his body temperature when he meditates? Now, one is talking about the nature of reality, and the other one wants to know kind of trivial thing, actually. I have to say, if you think about science, it's not very ambitious. In fact, serious scientists know that. They don't venture to really talk about the nature of reality because science is always a hypothesis. It's a prediction. Scientists mostly do predictions. They're like fortune tellers. That's what science is, in brief. You observe something many times and you assume that most likely it's going to happen again. That's all. Then you make complex calculations to predict how, for example, if you put certain things together, a bridge is not going to fall, but that's just a prediction. Science is just a calculation about future probabilities. Almost everything that you can think in science, in my opinion, can be explained in this way. So, strictly speaking, it's not very ambitious. It starts from certain premises which are not even really reflected upon much, and then it goes on to build these predictions. But Buddhism is supposed to be more ambitious. It's about the very nature of reality. So obviously it's going to be different. There's going to be something that doesn't match very well. It's like a different field of interest. Sometimes it overlaps, and some of the overlaps work well, some of them create some friction. But we have to expect it. It's created in a completely different environment. Also, we should keep in mind one thing: science was created in a Christian environment. This is something we have to keep in mind. Much of the terminology of science comes from a completely different background. It really affects the way science is explained. I can give you an example. Energy. Because we're not trained scientists, we think of energy as some actual thing, like a subtler thing that is among things and somehow sustains them or modifies them or something like that. But energy is just a prediction of probable behavior. When you think of energy, all it tells you is that when you say that here there is such and such an amount of electric energy, all it means is that is a prediction of what is going to happen when that entity is there. What is going to happen in future. So it's just a calculation about a prediction. But it's not an entity. But because of a background which used that idea of energy, a philosophical background from Europe, where that idea was very important, they used this concept of energy. If it were a Buddhist background, it would have developed in a different way, with a different language. So this is something we don't think. We think science is completely secular. Actually, it's not. I don't think so. And the very word secular is a Christian word. Did you ever think about it? The whole idea of a distinction between spiritual and secular is Christian. Nothing to do with Buddhism, nothing to do with Indian religions, completely Christian. So there's many things that we learn. We think they're neutral, they're like universal truths. No, they come from Europe and from the history of Christianity as well. So I think it's quite good sometimes to read what is said in texts which were produced before the scientific period. And we can get many different alternative ways, alternative perspectives. Even not just Buddhist. It's good if you study Buddhism to read other forms of Indian philosophy, for example. They're also very different from modern science. They're also very sophisticated. They're not foolish. You might agree with them or not, but they're very sophisticated. So, dismissing all that means we go in the direction of dismissing Buddhism.